You're a 16th century courtier, dressed in your finest silks, approaching towards England's most powerful woman. But instead of the sweet scent of rosewater you'd expect from royalty, your nostrils are assaulted by something that makes you gag. It's like rotting meat mixed with vinegar, with undertones of infected wounds and human decay. And here's the kicker. This isn't some plague victim or battlefield casualty. This is Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen herself. Gloriana, the woman who defeated the Spanish Armada and ushered in England's golden age. The same monarch who's been romanticized in countless films and novels was, quite literally, a walking biological hazard. I'm talking about queens who literally poisoned themselves with makeup, monarchs who lived in palaces overflowing with human waste, rulers whose bodies became factories of putrefaction while they still drew breath. And trust me, after hearing about a queen whose coronation ring grew into her actual flesh, you'll never complain about your boss's bad breath again. Let's begin with England's Virgin Queen, because her story perfectly illustrates how vanity can become a weapon of mass self-destruction. Elizabeth Tudor spent 45 years slowly poisoning herself in the name of beauty. Every morning, she would cake her face with Venetian ceruse, a makeup made from white lead and vinegar that was essentially toxic paint disguised as cosmetics. This wasn't a light application. Court records describe makeup so thick it could be measured in inches. Elizabeth built up layers of this poison over decades, creating what was essentially a chemical mask that was slowly eating her alive. The science behind this horror is straightforward. Lead acetate doesn't just sit on your skin looking pretty. It forms chemical bonds with human tissue, dissolving flesh while creating the illusion of porcelain perfection. Every day for nearly half a century, Elizabeth was essentially performing slow-motion facial suicide. The smell this process created defied natural description. Corroding lead mixed with decomposing tissue produced a metallic sweetness that could make battle-hardened soldiers gag. The vinegar base added its own acidic punch, creating an aroma so distinctive that palace staff could track Elizabeth's location through multiple rooms just by following the scent. But facial dissolution was merely the opening act of Elizabeth's bodily horror show. Her mouth had become a biological disaster zone. Decades of sugar consumption combined with zero dental hygiene had reduced her teeth to infected black stumps that constantly lacerated her tongue and gums. The perpetual taste of blood mixed with advanced periodontal disease created breath so foul that her food tasters would retch, not from detecting poison, but from the overwhelming stench wafting from her mouth during royal meals. The famous red hair that appears in every portrait, complete fiction. By her final years, Elizabeth was totally bald, her scalp a moonscape of infected sores and weeping scabs. The elaborate wigs she wore weren't fashion statements. They were necessary camouflage for a head that had become a breeding ground for parasites. Servants described removing these hairpieces as releasing clouds of lice and fleas that would scatter across her bedding like biblical plagues. But the detail that will haunt your dreams involves her coronation ring. After 45 years on the throne, the metal had literally fused with her finger. Flesh had grown completely over the ring, creating a permanent wound that constantly oozed pus. The infection smell was so potent she wore perfumed gloves that required changing multiple times daily just to contain the stench. During her final weeks, Elizabeth refused all cleaning attempts. Months of accumulated grime mixed with discharge from her various wounds had created a coating so revolting that even her most devoted servants could only endure her presence for minutes before rushing out to vomit in the corridors. Think serving a monarch whose very existence was an assault on human senses sounds challenging? Elizabeth's chemical nightmare is nothing compared to our next royal catastrophe. If Elizabeth's self-poisoning disturbs you, Marie Antoinette's living conditions will redefine your understanding of royal luxury. The Austrian princess, who became France's most notorious queen, resided in what was essentially Europe's most expensive bathroom. Versailles, despite its legendary magnificence, operated with virtually no functional plumbing. Thousands of nobles, servants, and visitors shared perhaps a dozen primitive toilets that overflowed constantly, sending rivers of waste streaming through walls and pooling under floors. throughout the palace. The daily waste management system was elegantly simple. Chamber pots were emptied directly from windows onto the grounds below. The famous gardens of Versailles were literally fertilized with human excrement. Visitors had to navigate carefully through this minefield of waste, frequently slipping and tumbling into putrid sludge. The stench rising from acres of sun-baked feces was so overwhelming that many guests would vomit before even reaching the palace entrance. Marie Antoinette herself wasn't exempt from this sewage roulette. Historical accounts document her being doused multiple times by waste hurled from upper windows. France's most powerful woman, draped in silks worth more than entire villages, would find herself soaked in strangers' excrement, the reek penetrating her elaborate powdered coiffure and priceless fabrics. The outdoor waste management was merely the prelude to Versailles' indoor sanitation apocalypse. Throughout the palace interior, aristocrats routinely used hallways, corners, and spaces behind tapestries as personal bathrooms. The ammonia smell had penetrated so deeply into walls and furnishings that it became the palace's signature scent. One princess documented, "Walking anywhere means witnessing someone relieving themselves. Urine odor saturates everything, mixing with rotting food and unwashed bodies." Marie Antoinette's towering hairstyles, those architectural marvels that reached heights of 3 feet or more, remained constructed for weeks, sometimes months, without ever being dismantled for cleaning. Powder mixed with natural scalp oils and perspiration to form a cement-like paste that permanently trapped insects. Lice, fleas, and other parasites became embedded in this hardened mixture, creating living colonies that fed continuously on her scalp. The queen employed servants whose entire job description was using long ivory picks to scratch her head through the elaborate hairstyle, providing relief from the constant itching caused by insect infestations. These scratching sessions would dislodge avalanches of powder mixed with dead bugs and infected skin flakes, creating a revolting snowfall around wherever the queen happened to be sitting. Marie Antoinette's solution to this olfactory warfare wasn't improving sanitation. It was drowning herself in increasingly powerful perfumes. She would apply fragrances so heavily that courtiers' eyes would stream with tears, but the underlying stenches of waste, decay, and unwashed flesh would still penetrate through. One diplomat described the overall sensory experience as roses planted directly in sewage. Her undergarments, replaced weekly if she was fortunate, became so thoroughly saturated with menstrual blood, urine, and other bodily fluids that they had to be incinerated rather than laundered. Servants reported that the smell from her discarded clothing would contaminate laundry areas for days, even after the garments had been completely burned to ash. Revolting as Elizabeth's chemical face-eating and Marie Antoinette's sewage palace may be, our final royal horror makes both previous stories look like minor hygiene oversights. Mary Tudor's story represents the absolute pinnacle of royal physical decay. During her brief 5-year reign, she managed to execute nearly 300 religious dissidents, while her own body transformed into something that belonged in a morgue rather than on a throne. Mary suffered from what medical historians now identify as ovarian cancer, but the way this disease manifested reads like something from a supernatural horror story. Her body began producing a sweet, cloying odor, the unmistakable scent of internal rot seeping through her pores. This wasn't poor hygiene or neglected wounds. This was the smell of death emanating from a living person, growing stronger with each passing day. The Queen experienced repeated phantom pregnancies, her abdomen swelling dramatically with what she desperately believed were future Catholic heirs to secure her religious reforms. In medical reality, these were likely massive tumors or fluid accumulation from her advancing disease. As these false pregnancies developed, her belly would distend until she appeared 9 months pregnant. But instead of life growing within her, it was decay. These tumors would periodically rupture, releasing foul-smelling fluid that would completely saturate her clothing. This discharge had the consistency of pus mixed with blood, and the stench was so overpowering that servants would vomit while attempting to change her garments. Mary refused to acknowledge these episodes, insisting that any moisture was simply normal pregnancy discharge. Her skin began developing a yellowish, waxy texture as her liver failed to process the toxins flooding her system from diseased organs. The smell seeping from her pores resembled overripe fruit mixed with the metallic tang of blood. Courtiers reported being able to detect the queen's approach from multiple rooms away simply by following the scent through the palace corridors. The disease consumed her body systematically and relentlessly. Her gums turned black and began receding, causing her teeth to loosen and fall out one by one. The constant taste of blood and pus in her mouth created breath so foul that normal conversation became virtually impossible. Food would begin decomposing in her mouth before she could swallow it, adding yet another layer to the horrific bouquet of odors. Her hair fell out in massive clumps, exposing a scalp covered in weeping sores and infected scabs. The smell from these wounds was so intense that she wore heavy headdresses not for royal fashion, but purely to contain the stench. Servants would discover maggots in her discarded headwear, feeding on the constant discharge from her scalp infections. Her royal garments became museums of biological horror. The expensive velvets and silks, never properly cleaned due to her refusal to fully undress, were stained with blood, pus, and other bodily fluids that had dried into crusty patches. The fabric around her midsection was particularly disgusting, stiffened with dried discharge from ruptured tumors, creating a texture like hardened leather that would crackle audibly when she moved. One lady-in-waiting recorded in her private diary, "Approaching Her Majesty resembles entering a tomb where the occupant still draws breath. The sweet stench of corruption mingles with the sharp bite of infected wounds and the sour reek of vomit, for the Queen can barely retain any food." During her final months, Mary became completely isolated, not through political maneuvering, but because her physical presence had become genuinely unbearable. Even her most loyal Catholic supporters would invent elaborate excuses to avoid private audiences. The Queen would sit alone in her chambers, her body consuming itself from within, the smell of her decay so potent that it would seep through stone walls and contaminate neighboring rooms. The putrid truth about absolute authority. 3 queens, 3 different paths to the same revolting destination. Each woman wielded absolute power over millions of lives, commanded vast armies, and shaped the course of human history. Yet none of them could master the basic human challenge of personal hygiene. Elizabeth I dissolved her own face with vanity while governing an empire that spanned continents. Marie Antoinette presided over a palace of human waste while her subjects starved in the streets. Mary I rotted from within while sending hundreds of people to burn at the stake. The pattern reveals something disturbing about the relationship between absolute power and basic human decency. When you can command armies but can't maintain elementary cleanliness, when you can execute subjects but can't clean your own body, you've crossed a fundamental line that separates rulers from human beings entirely. These women didn't just rule badly, they became living proof that unlimited authority corrupts not just morally, but physically. Their bodies became battlefields where vanity, neglect, and disease fought while their minds commanded empires. Authority may be intoxicating, but it's apparently no substitute for soap, water, and basic self-awareness. Sometimes the most powerful people in history were also the most powerfully, unforgettably, disgustingly revolting.